It's great to welcome to the program today Caleb Cain, who runs the YouTube channel Faraday Speaks. He's involved in de-radicalizing young people who get involved in the far right and is actually the subject of the recent New York Times article, The Making of a YouTube Radical by Kevin Roose, which has gotten a lot of attention. Caleb, great to talk to you. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you for having me on.
So first things first, I mean, how did the New York Times even find you and decide that you would be the good subject of an article about radicalization and de-radicalization?
Well, when I first put the video out, I never expected it to go that viral. But what I think happened was I went to Twitter and I was basically trying to market the video a little bit. And I was talking to a lot of people on there and just like going through and explaining old ideas that I had. And it seemed like a lot of people were kind of interested by that. They'd never had someone come out and do that before. And at some point, I remember Christian Piccolini messaged me
Yeah.
and he was like, "Hey, man, are you going to put out a video on all this?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Well, let me know when you do." My theory is that they retweeted that stuff and that's why it got so viral. I also shared it in some gaming Discord servers and Destiny watched it on his stream. But I imagine that the New York Times probably just found it through those channels on Twitter, or I don't know how exactly they found the video, but I was just going through my email one day and I had an email from Kevin. I had a lot of emails from a lot of journalists at that time, but the New York Times is the one that I went with for the exclusive on that.
So for people who are not familiar with your story, you became radicalized to the far right, heavily influenced by some of these echo chamber algorithm recommended rabbit holes that exist online. Can you talk about sort of what your life situation was at the beginning of this? In other words, because with so often radicalization goes hand in hand with certain particular life circumstances at the time that someone is vulnerable to that radicalization. So what was going on in your life when you started to get pulled into this rabbit hole?
Yeah, so just the brief summary is I come from like a kind of a lower middle class, not even middle class, like an upper lower class background. And so I didn't have a lot of money. I failed out of college due to like depression. And then I hopped around a little bit, but then I ended up back at home in West Virginia and at my grandfather's house. And I was really depressed and beaten up. And I had been told in high school that I was bright, that I was going places, that I was going to do all these great things. And then none of that stuff happened. And quite the opposite happened. And I was so depressed that like I was literally laying in bed all day, only getting up to use the bathroom and eat. And I went to YouTube to try to fix myself, basically.
And when you go to YouTube to fix yourself, what is the first thing you start searching for that seems like it might be useful to you in the circumstances you were in?
Well, I had found a game streamer that I'd used to watch in high school. He goes by the channel Athene Wins. And he had started doing all these neuroscience videos. He did this documentary called God is in the Neurons. And I watched that. And then I started like doing more research on consciousness, on neuroscience, self-help. And I mean, once the algorithm filled up, I was just clicking thumbnails. And it was from there that I found the content creator Stefan Molyneux that I would later find.
And so you start at the time, you're not yet familiar with Stefan Molyneux, but you're pulled into some of his content based on the recommendations from the algorithm. And then what is it that starts to happen in your mind when you start consuming his content?
So first, he did give me some tangential benefits, right? So like I started caring more about like personal responsibility. Started caring more about honesty, but then like at the same time, I was also picking up a lot of these political ideas that he had. And in my mind, the way that he framed it and the way that I absorbed it was that the political ideologies and the self-help went hand in hand. That being a traditional conservative was like the way you had to go if you wanted to be happy. And if you wanted to like have this actualized life, that liberalism was like this failed ideology and you were just going to have casual sex and be depressed perpetually. And it melded well. He welded those two things together, and I just absorbed all of it.
That's super interesting because that's been one of my critiques of Jordan Peterson, which is that the self-help type stuff is both relatively harmless and arguably mildly positive, and it also is quite uncontroversial and unoriginal in a sense. But the problem is when people see that content as invariably connected to the more political content that Jordan Peterson is putting out there, which often is not even labeled as political, but it gets to the heart of politics about individualism and egalitarianism and responsibility and all of these other things. That's the danger, that sometimes the self-help is relatively innocuous, but it is indistinguishable from the politics, at least in the minds of a lot of the young people that start getting sucked into this stuff. And if I hear you correctly, you're sort of describing a similar mechanism.
Yeah, and I mean, I like Jordan Peterson too when I found him, for the same reasons. I mean, I guess the way I would put it is like it's like the sugar that helps that red pill go down, right? So they've got to have a selling point. I like to think of it from like a marketing perspective. So there's got to be like a hook to draw you in.
So let's continue down the rabbit hole. You get into Stefan Molyneux, and then where does the interest go next?
It's hard to tell. I went through my algorithm, and it looks like what happened, and what I remember happening is it's weird. So Molyneux I would put like in the alt-right category, which is pretty far to the right in terms of like the center. But I kind of found Steven Crowder and like a lot of the conservatives next, and like I found Rubin. And I was kind of watching a lot of those guys. I was listening to a lot of stuff about free, and I guess I found it because of like the libertarianism stuff, the free market economics, and that's why I was listening to them. And so I went from being like a libertarian to a conservative, and then from listening to them, I started later finding content creators like Lauren Southern and Gavin, and then I kind of came full circle and was listening to Steph again, and that was when I kind of drifted into that alt-right civic, what they would call civic nationalism, into that sort of category.
And is part of what was going on, I'm curious, like how established your political beliefs were before all of this started, because what pulled you into this from the beginning was actually recognizing that you weren't happy with your life circumstances and you wanted to improve them. You said, fix yourself at the beginning of our interview. How entrenched were your political beliefs in general at the time?
When I went to the right, or before that?
Before, when you first started getting into YouTubers and eventually got to some of the more political ones, did you identify politically as someone on the left, or were you relatively apolitical?
Yeah, I mean, I did. I guess I wasn't very well read politically, but I was very much like, I went to school. When I first went to college, I wanted to work on helping the environment. So I did civil engineering, and I intended to transition to environmental engineering after I got to the next tier of school past the community college. So I was big into that. I was also really socially liberal. So I was really politically outspoken. I would get in a lot of arguments with my Republican family. But looking back, I guess I wasn't super well read, and that's why I even fell into that stuff in the first place.
So as this continues, how long would you say that you were deeply entrenched in right-wing beliefs during this phase that you were consuming all of this content?
Well, it was a dip going in, and then kind of a valley, and then it was like a dip, a rise coming out. Meaning I didn't just like find ContraPoints in destiny and become a liberal or something. So I would say like 4.5 to 5 years that I was consuming that content and seriously thinking about it.
And during that time, were you an activist for these beliefs in other areas of your life, or was it mostly limited to consuming the content online?
It was mostly limited to consuming content, but like anytime I had an opportunity in my day-to-day life, so like any of my relationships, and I chased off a lot of friends this way. I alienated a lot of people, and I noticed that people didn't want to talk politics with me. So I had a fiance at the time that they talked about in the article. I would push my beliefs on her a lot. I would also do like a lot of psychoanalyzing on her, because that's like what Steph kind of taught me to do. So I would do that with her, and then she had a brother-in-law that I would like argue with, and he just got to the point where he wouldn't discuss that stuff with me. So it was mostly just people in my personal life that I would quote unquote try to red pill.
So it sounds like in a few ways this hurt relationships in your sort of real life, but to get back to, you said your initial goal at the beginning was, again, to improve your life. Other than getting you into political beliefs that you now realize are problematic and no longer follow, did consuming this content improve your life in any other measurable ways?
I mean, I took on a lot of the values that Steph purported to hold, right? So like honesty, like after that, I've always been a pretty honest person, but after that, I like very much try to stick with that. I started thinking about personal responsibility in a way that I never really thought about it before. I mean, to me though, these aren't things that I needed to become a right winger to figure out though. But I guess I could say that those were some of the positive benefits. But in other way, like all in all, it just alienated me from like a lot of people.
What started to change when the YouTube algorithm ultimately led you to a path out of the right-wing beliefs? Was it one video in particular that you remember popped up in that algorithm? Did something change in you that maybe made you start looking for other things?
No, no, nothing made me look for anything new, and I would have kept going down that path. And now that I talk to people further to the right, I wonder if I would have went into the National Socialist category or not. I don't
Wow.
know. But because I was just heading down that trajectory, so I don't know what would have happened if I kept going. It was by chance. It was the fact that Destiny did those debates. I thought that it was the Lawrence Southern was the first video that popped up, but apparently he did a conversation with Martin Shkreli, who was somebody that I was interested in back then.
Hmm.
And so he did a conversation with Martin, and then ironically, he did a conversation with Athene Wins, the guy that I mentioned earlier, and then he did the conversation with Lauren. So I was almost primed to like Destiny a little bit because of those previous conversations. I thought when he had the conversation with Lauren, it was going to be like a nice conversation because he had such a cordial conversation with Martin. I thought he was a right winger. And then I watched the conversation with Lauren, and he really deconstructed a lot of arguments that she had on mass immigration, which was my huge sticking point. And then after that, I just kept watching more and more Destiny videos. And then I found ContraPoints through Destiny's videos because of the algorithm, because she did an interview with Destiny. And then I started watching her content. It wasn't until her content that I found other people's content. Before that, it was all hidden behind this like curtain on YouTube.
And just to make sure the audience knows, so some of the people you're mentioning, Destiny is a video game streamer who I've interviewed on the show and is a friend of mine. His real name is Steve Bennell, and I just saw him in Los Angeles a couple weeks ago, as people might know. ContraPoints is YouTuber Natalie Wynn, who I've also interviewed on the program, who's doing really, really great work about exposing fascism and authoritarianism and a lot of other stuff. So how long would you say the deprogramming period lasted, sort of like from the first time, not maybe that you watched a Destiny debate, but when it actually started to reach you in a way where you were starting to reconsider your beliefs until you considered yourself kind of like out of the right wing? How long was that process?
Well, I found Destiny at the beginning of 28, like the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, and then or no, yeah. So it began at the beginning of 2018. So I guess it took about like a year and a half, something like that.
And at the end point, what do you now, what's your assessment of what it is that happened here? I mean, you went in and out, both in a sense as a result of the same YouTube algorithm that on different days is going to recommend different things to you in a way that it contains so many variables that it's hard for us to even say exactly why it is that things come up when they come up. How do you see these several years of your life that went one way and then a very different way?
It's really bizarre. I mean, even when I was a right winger, I would sit and think, I was like, just a couple years ago, I was a lefty. I'm a right winger now. This is weird. But I mean, they got all the best arguments, so I guess they're right. I mean, that's what I believed at the time. I guess it's alienating. Looking back, I was searching for something. I was in a dark place, and I was searching for something to get me out of it. And I had found something that I thought got me out of that. I also had an addiction to YouTube, something I've had to analyze since then. There's like a draw, not just to go deeper into the ideology, because there's like an addiction to that, but also just to consume more and more content.
Which is actually really what the algorithm is meant to do. I mean, a lot of the conversations that now are coming up about is YouTube biased to the left or to the right, and what about their internal employee culture versus the way they relate to regulation. In the end, when it comes to the algorithm, everything I see continues to suggest to me that it's an algorithm meant to encourage people watching for as long as possible, which is what's the most profitable for YouTube, period.
Yep, and I'm pretty sure that's what YouTube said. The algorithm's name is Reinforce. That's the name of the AI. That is the most dystopian thing I've ever heard, by the way. Reinforce. Reinforce what? Like, so yeah, that's all they care about. And you know, people talk about their politics. Yeah, YouTube's left leaning, sure. It looks like they did do some. I haven't looked into the Project Veritas thing too much, but it does look like they have a political bias there. That doesn't surprise me. But the thing is people, I've seen people say, well, it's a majority lefty content on YouTube. And it's not really. If you're counting the late night the late night shows, then sure. But for a long time when I was in that space, and we used to brag about it, that YouTube was dominated by right wingers. It was all right wing creators that I was watching. And even the bread tubers that I found later, they haven't been around for that long. I mean, Cat Black and people like you have been on YouTube for a while, but it was mostly dominated by the Sargons of Akkads and the Molyneux and the Southerns and the Gavins. And
the other thing also, though, Caleb, is that we have to be able to say, okay, you're doing you're looking at what is the content that's on YouTube and how is it doing. There's also the reality that a company's internal culture does not necessarily tell us as a corporate entity what the political biases are. I mean, on the one hand, yes, Google has rules about diversity and how LGBT people should be treated, and it all sounds so lefty, but at the same time, Google's part of the surveillance industrial complex and working with government in ways that I don't know any progressive that would say those are progressive values, as an example, when it comes to anti-regulation or, quote, regulating ourselves, as I recently spoke about with Joe Rogan. So it's also important when we have those conversations to really say, what is it that we're assessing when we measure how many left versus right-wing channels, as opposed to what are the corporate priorities of Google or YouTube? These are all important conversations, but different ones.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, to me, I think that Google's corporate priority is just to make money. I don't think they're trying to push people in any particular direction. I just think it's about money at the end of the day.
Make sure, if you have not read the article in the New York Times, to read it, The Making of a YouTube Radical. We've been speaking with the subject of that article, Caleb Cain, who runs the YouTube channel Faraday Speaks. Caleb, really appreciate your time and you talking to me today. And I'm glad you got out of the valley, as you called it.
Yeah, thanks, man. Yeah, and just real quick, what we're working on right now is we have a Discord server. It's very experimental, but we're trying to show the other side to these people that have kind of fallen into this rabbit hole, and to give them emotional support to kind of pull them out.
And how can people find that?
So you can find that if you go to my YouTube videos and go into the link, there's a link in the description to the Discord channel. It's called Faraday Fam on Discord. But if you just go to any of my YouTube videos at Faraday Speaks on YouTube, you'll find the link to the Discord in the description of all videos.
All right. Thanks so much, Caleb.
Thank you, David.